Hello everyone, my name is Asha and my project is on the subgenre of Japanese Gothic literature, so let's just jump right into it. Also, fair warning, many of these names are in Japanese and a little bit hard for me to pronounce, so I apologize ahead of time for anything I may say wrong. So my objectives for this presentation are to explore the characteristics of the Japanese subgenre, really what defines it and makes it so unique, to discuss the use and significance of women and the role that they play in the subgenre, why they're such a defining feature of it, and to finally analyze the collection of short stories, Japanese Gothic Tales by Kyoka Izumi. So to define Japanese Gothic, obviously in every Gothic subgenre there is that aspect of terror versus horror. Terror, of course, being that sense of impending doom, and horror kind of being that doom coming into play. So I think that Japanese authors tend to lean more towards horror. That isn't to say that they don't put emphasis on building a tense atmosphere and a sense of the weird or uncanny, but usually it does end in a more grotesque and sudden imagery that really is what leaves a lasting impression on audiences. It has actually been described or referred to as a slower genre. I think hypnotic might be a better label for that, and I'll tell you why in a second. Slow is usually a pretty uncommon term when you're talking about horror or the Gothic genre, but I believe it's the emphasis on terror that really leads them to that. These stories can sometimes seem to be in a dream or trance-like state or experienced in slow motion, which is really where that hypnotic kind of label may come from. And this really only adds to the commonly used psychological horror trope that many Japanese authors go for. So, defining characteristics. Of course, powerful women, we'll talk more about this in a minute, but women in the Gothic literature in general kind of tend to be oppressed and end up finding some way of escaping that, whether it be death or running away. Japanese women, however, are commonly depicted as more powerful, scary, and even wild at times. The rural versus urban settings. Many early examples of Gothic authors like Sasaki Kaizen, Ude Akinari, and Kyoka Izumi used rural settings. They focused more on the characters' environments and used those environments and nature itself to build the atmosphere, sometimes even creating the issues of the stories themselves. Really, one of the most defining characteristics of this subgenre, though, would be the use of the supernatural, usually in the form of vengeful spirits, the living dead, demonic possession, creatures from folklore or myths, or simply just unexplainable events and experiences. Instead of focusing on the unsettling or unnatural appearance of these kind of creatures, though, authors tend to focus on the entity's tragic or twisted stories, often appearing sad or angry or vengeful, usually because of some kind of wrongdoing that was happened to them in their life. Women in the subgenre. Now, for the most part in Gothic literature, women don't always play the biggest roles, but they definitely play a much larger role in Japanese Gothic. Like most other subgenres, they may start off as being oppressed, but one of the differences is that they always find a way to transgress from this oppression, most often by becoming the supernatural entities that end up causing the problems of the stories themselves. They are often driven by very intense emotions, usually sorrow, vengeance, or some kind of wrongdoing that happened to them in their life or caused their death. They are most commonly in the form of ghosts, pretty much, sometimes using possession or curses. They are often portrayed as the opposite of how traditional Japanese women would normally appear. So instead of appearing put together and graceful and obedient, They usually appear unruly, wild, and very powerful, which usually is a kind of threat to the patriarchy. This picture on the side here is basically the Japanese version of Bloody Mary. Her name is Hanako, and it's one of those old stories you tell in the girls' bathroom about going down to the third stall and knocking and asking if she's in there, and she'll appear for you. So Izumi Kyoka, he was one of the most well-known and original authors of this subgenre. Many would argue that he really was the father of this subgenre. He was often known for his romanticism of tragedy and the supernatural. He grew up in poverty and traveled around the Japanese countryside all of his life, which really was made apparent in many of his stories. He was inspired by childhood folk tales and mangas like The Shank's Mare. He also shares many similarities with Western authors like Gerard de Nerval and Charles Baudelaire. Sorry. But unlike French authors, he focuses on the shadowy countryside rather than modern urban decay. His settings usually consisted of mountains, farms, and small towns and villages like the ones that he usually traveled to. He has been called the master of slow horror because most of his protagonists are seen wandering or lost in some way, usually haunted either by an old lost love or the death of someone close to them. So Japanese Gothic Tales is the title of his collection of short stories. It consists of 4 short stories, the first one being The Surgery Room. This is about a distinguished countess who is due for a life-saving surgery, and the doctor who is to perform this surgery is an old friend of the narrator. Now, the countess refuses to go under any anesthesia in fear of sharing her big secret that no one else knows. Obviously, there's an argument trying to get her to undergo the anesthesia so that they can perform the surgery to save her life, until she insists that either she stays awake for the surgery or she dies of her illness. So when the doctor finally agrees, she ends up revealing the secret anyways in the middle of her surgery before she takes her own life suddenly. And this secret did end up being that her and the doctor who was performing her surgery were in love. It's unclear whether they had some kind of past affair or current affair, but they had feelings for each other. So I think this is a good example of the obvious romanticism that he has for self-sacrifice, either for the sake of love or the sake of her own dignity. It's unclear. Also, of oppressed women taking a drastic way out of their own oppression. She was clearly unhappy in the marriage that she was in, not with the man that she loved. The second and probably most well-known of all of his stories is The Holy Man of Mount Koya. The picture you see here, it says the Saint of Mount Koya, same thing, different translation. So this story is a tale about a monk's journey through the mountains and wilderness, experiencing many unsettling and strange and pretty much just unexplainable experiences. Many of these, however, did include him just interacting with kind of the dark side of human nature. So this is another good example of how he prefers to have his settings in the country and mountainsides. It's a good example of how he tends to blur the lines between the supernatural and reality, often mixing in the environment so that the line is a little more blurred and you can't tell what's real, what's unexplainable, and supernatural. So the third story is One Day in Spring. This is a priest telling a traveler about the mysterious death of a previous traveler who the priest tells him is just like him. It ends up to be very true when he dies in the same mysterious circumstances. One of the mysterious circumstances is that everyone believes that this man died after he fell in love with one of the wives of the most powerful men in the town that they were residing in. So this story shows the power contrast between men and women, the woman really holding the power in this situation, and also the romanticism of supernatural, and again, that kind of almost sense of self-sacrifice. The last story is, I'm honestly not sure how to say this, Osin and Sokichi. The story is of a man who was saved by the lover of his employer after he attempted suicide. Again, giving the power to the woman. She was the one that saved him and promised that they would run away together and be away from the man that she was with and the man that employed the other one. This also shows his romanticism of escapism and almost a savior complex. And this is my bibliography. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed.